So in our first set of notes, we looked at succession, and we focused specifically on the boreal forest. Today we're going to look at biodiversity. And so biodiversity is referring to the variety of life in a specific area. And generally when we are talking about biodiversity, we designate a specific area, such as the biodiversity of this pond, or the biodiversity of the forest, or the biodiversity of the region, or the continent, or the globe. And so we look at biodiversity because biodiversity has benefits. And one of the main benefits of biodiversity is an increase in resilience for that ecosystem. When it comes to stress or other disturbances. And when we talk about biodiversity, there's generally three different types that we talk about. The first one is genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is the variation in genes within a population or a species. And an example that we used earlier in the semester was the diversity in peppered moths in England during the Industrial Revolution. And during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot more pollution and soot being produced than before, and these peppered moths within their population varied from lighter colored to darker colored. And we saw that over time, they became, on average, darker colored because they were able to survive better in the polluted conditions around the city. And so the diversity in peppered moths allowed them to adapt to pollution. And on the other side of that coin, a lack of genetic diversity in a population of animals leaves them vulnerable to disease and stress or other disturbances. And so if there's a very narrow range of immune systems within a population of organisms, and a disease comes through and it kills one of them, it's likely going to kill all of them. And so we see this within some domestic breeds of animals, and we also see this when there is something like the founder effect on an island or in an area. And the second type of biodiversity that we talk about is species diversity. So when we look at a forest, or we look at a pond, or we look at an area, we can talk about the species diversity within that area. And tropical rainforests are some of the most diverse places on the planet. And so within the tropical rainforest, there's many different species of animals that are performing the same ecological roles. And so if one of these animals goes extinct, then the system as a whole is resilient. So if there's some sort of insect that's pollinating a specific flower, and that insect goes extinct, it's fairly likely that in the jungle, in the rainforest, there will be another species of insect that's performing that same task. And on the other side of that, we see an extreme lack of diversity and large agricultural monocrops. And these are areas where they have thousands of acres of plants of the same exact species planted directly next to each other with no biodiversity in place. And these areas are very vulnerable to pests and disease, which is why we see all kinds of poisons for different types of insects and plants being sprayed over these large areas. They require a lot of intensive outside energy in order to manage because of their lack of diversity. And then the third type of diversity we're going to look at is ecosystem diversity. And so this is the number of different ecosystems within an area. And I think a specifically good example is the example of the Inca. The Inca were one of the largest civilizations, empires in human history, as well as one of the longest lasting. And they were very resilient in South America, where they domesticated many of the crops that we still eat today. One of the reasons why they were so resilient, if we look here at the map, is that they had many different climates and ecosystems within a small area that they were using for agriculture. And so we see here that Ecuador's around here, the equator is somewhere around here, and there's mountains along the coast here. And these are really tall mountains. And because of the mountains, there's one side that gets a lot of rain, and the other side is very dry. And it's also right up against the ocean here as well. And so you have an ocean ecosystem, and then you have a mountain ecosystem going down into valleys, on one side wet and on one side dry. And you could see that the Inca were resilient because of the many overlapping climates and ecosystems that they inhabited, and they used them all for agriculture, and it was condensed into a small area. And so if there was some kind of drought or disturbance within one of the ecosystems, there was many other ecosystems present that resources and subsistence foods could be harvested from. And so the tall mountains along the coast near the equator created different climates based on altitude because of the mountains and precipitation. And then the other example, on the other side, from diversity of ecosystems, in which there can be large grasslands with no other ecosystem around. And in this case, a drought can cause population collapse. So if there's only one ecosystem that's producing food, and then the conditions change within that ecosystem, oftentimes the whole region can suffer. And so there's different ways that we lose biodiversity. Within genetic biodiversity, we see population bottlenecks, which we talked a little bit about earlier. We also see the founder effect. Etc. Conditions where there end up being a few organisms that are restarting a population. And then so with species biodiversity, what we really see is extinctions. This is when we have a complete loss of a species. And background extinction refers to gradual isolated events. And this is considered the normal extinction rate. On the other hand, we have mass extinctions, and we've had 5 of them so far on the planet, and many people believe that we are currently in the middle of the 6th. And this is where a large percentage goes extinct in a short amount of time. And then the third type of losing biodiversity, ecosystem biodiversity, can be lost due to climate change. So we can be losing entire ecosystems when the climate shifts and the conditions for those ecosystems shift. Speaking of ecosystem shifting, keystone species are species that tend to manage their ecosystem. So these are species that many other species depend on in an ecosystem. And a great example is beavers, which create their own habitat, and a habitat as well for birds and fish, and many other invertebrates and other types of animal and plant and fungal and bacterial life. And so these guys are kind of ecosystem engineers. And another one who we might not think of as being engineers so much are the elephants, which many people would describe as gardeners. So these guys, they maintain grasslands, prevent the growth of the forest, taking over the grasslands. They spread seeds and nutrients far and wide, as they have really large and varying migration patterns. And there's many species that of plant as well as animal that rely on the nutrients brought by the elephant dung. And then we see a famous example recently in history in Yellowstone National Park of the wolves, which inhibited overgrazing and prevented soil erosion along the rivers and brought back habitat for all different types of species, including beavers, which transformed the habitat further, along with many songbirds and other types of animals. And then, as our last example, we have the ultimate keystone species, humans, who design and create our own habitats, and are one of the largest acting forces on the planet today. And so with that, we'll end our notes on biodiversity.